Well, welcome back to the podcast, Bluewater. We are here with Dr. James Boudreau for part 2 of our conversation about M.A.I.D, or medical assistance in dying. Thanks for being back with us, James.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't even have an outfit change.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is a pretty short break we give between sessions, but
you guys drive a very, very hard. Your real taskmasters.
That's Bob.
I got
right?
that out.
Yeah,
See, I'm exhausted already.
He gives this look from behind the ones and twos, and it says everything it needs to, just his eyes. Last episode, we kind of set up the problem. We talked about what is the state of M.A.I.D in Canada? Why does this matter? How are doctors like yourself seeing this play out, or how are they feeling? Are they feeling pressured to be part of this in the healthcare system? All this kind of stuff. So if you haven't checked that out, please go back and listen to part 1. We also talked about the difference between like end of life care in relieving pain and suffering. Versus actively taking someone's life. And a good question kind of came up is, as Christians, do we need to prolong human life as long as possible? Are we bound to keep the feeding tube in? Are we bound to take every possible measure to sustain life as long as possible? And would it be wrong to not? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, those cases do come up. You hear about patients who are, in an intensive care unit on a ventilator, where they, with every available testing that we have, appear to be brain dead. The only thing keeping them alive is a machine breathing for them, mm-hmm. and it's often attributed to religious beliefs. Although I've never been so directly involved in these cases that I've had a look at it myself, but it's often attributed to religious beliefs that the family refuses to have life support stopped.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it does, we do have to think then about, what does life really mean? Right. Mm-hmm, if the patient is brain dead, right, like their essence of their person and personality are gone, they're unable to sustain their life at all on their own means, where we would expect as an adult, that they can. Is there an obligation to keep them alive? Yeah. Personally, I would say I think that's a very different question than somebody who, again, is able to articulate and consent to M.A.I.D to having their life ended prematurely. Mm-hmm. The patients on those ventilators who are dependent on them, they are dead, brain dead. The only thing keeping them alive is a tube and a machine that's putting the breaths in. Mm-hmm. I think it's more acknowledging the reality of the situation and allowing natural, measures to kind of catch up with the person, rather than keeping somebody who, is alive in a meaningful sense alive.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction. We kind of touched on this last episode as well, but that isn't what we're talking about when we talk about M.A.I.D. That isn't made to remove someone from life support who is otherwise going to die naturally. That isn't made to remove a feeding tube or to not pursue any and every medical technology available to sustain life if natural death would take place otherwise.
That's
and for a Christian, we have to remember death is not the worst thing that can happen to a Christian. As wild as that is to say, dying is not the worst thing that can happen to a Christian. To die is to be with Christ. Paul says to die is gain. And so it's fundamentally a different understanding of what death is. And it is not wrong for a Christian to allow death. Again, these are sometimes complicated decisions of what measures to take and when, but it is not wrong or sinful for a Christian to allow death to happen in its natural timing to those that we love. And we want to, again, see them not be in pain and these types of things. But I think that is really important, because people may feel like, well, I don't want to be committing M.A.I.D accidentally or taking someone's life. And these are just two very different things.
Yeah, that's right.
So again, we kind of set up the problem last time, but now we want to talk about how do Christians understand this? How are we supposed to weigh through this? What does the Bible say about this? How should we understand suffering? And man, there's some big questions. One of them that came in was just, often, sometimes our pets die from natural causes, but a lot of the time we seem to be okay with the euthanizing of animals. Why? Some people might even flip, who are skeptics might say, well, you Christians are totally okay with things like that. How is this any different? Why is this any different? Why would we say that there's something different when it comes to the taking of human life in an unnatural way like this? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't want to tread on any pet lovers' toes here, but it should be fairly apparent from a Christian worldview that there is a fundamental difference between human life and animal life.
Yeah,
right. That we are given authority over the animal kingdom, which doesn't permit cruelty or anything like that. Right. But it does mean that within responsible means we can use animals to sustain ourselves. It also means that we have an authority over animal life that actually, as weird as it sounds to modern ears, I don't think we have that same level of authority over our own lives or over the lives of other human beings, right? That as being made in the image of God, there's something profoundly unique about human life that gives it a value that cannot be equated to the life of animals, which again, I stress that we should absolutely respect and treat them humanely. But it would diminish the value of human life to equate it to the life of animals.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And we hear this in the Bible right from back in Genesis 1, right? That it's human beings that are made in the image of God. And so as awesome as our pets are and as awesome as all the created order is, there's something fundamentally different about human beings in the way that we are made that makes our life valuable to a different degree. And so this is kind of just a category difference, right? Now today, some people, we do understand that in so many ways. You will find the odd activist out there who disagrees and says, we're all in the same equal playing field in terms of the value of human life and animal life. But we sometimes even choose when we believe this. Like, you'll be hard pressed today if you stood in the public square and you get more people to sign a petition protecting turtle eggs than you would the unborn, likely. So there is times where people choose to not believe this, but fundamentally we do understand that human life is different, and as Christians we certainly believe that because we've been made in God's image in a unique and special way. Now, when Christians hear about something like M.A.I.D, and again, over 5%, if you remember from last episode, guys, he said over 5%, so more than 1 in 20 people dying in Canada are dying in the pursuit of M.A.I.D or through M.A.I.D, medical assistance in dying. So this will come up in our lives. How should Christians understand this? What does the Bible say about this? And before we get to some specific verses, let's talk a little bit about the theology of suffering. When we talk about M.A.I.D, we're talking about people's pain being relieved. That's even included in the definition you gave, right? Should we, with everything in us, always push back against suffering, or should we understand it differently as Christians as something that is as Pastor Tim would say, a primary tool in God's tool chest? Is this always a bad thing, and should we rail against it with everything we got to the extent of something like M.A.I.D?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do want to acknowledge that suffering is something that occurred as a result of the fall. So it was not part of God's original creation, right?
That's a good point.
After the fall, it's, the sweat of your brow will you bring forth food, and women will have the pain of childbirth. So it is part of the curse of our own fallen status. And we do look forward to the day when Christ returns and that is going to be changed. But it is also one of God's primary tools, I think, in sanctification, the process of growing more holy. And again, it speaks to a very significant difference between how our modern culture views our sense of autonomy and what the purpose of our life is versus
Right.
what a believer thinks about that, right?
Yeah.
So for a believer, we are not primarily on this earth to have a good time. We're very blessed, especially in Canada, with the abundance of, food and shelter and safety and all of those wonderful blessings, and we praise God for that. But we're also put here to do His will. And in a fallen world, to do God's will, to be a soldier in the kingdom, we are going to face suffering and persecution. And I think fundamentally one of the big challenges is, with M.A.I.D is that you don't know what God's plan is for your life until the very end, that He can use you even in a state where you yourself are not the agent to accomplish His purposes. And so it's fundamentally a question of, who does our life belong to? Does it belong to us, or does it belong to God? Do we have the right to decide when our life ends and when our service to Him is complete, or is that His call to make?
Yeah.
Which is, this is the challenge when you're trying to talk to somebody who isn't a believer about M.A.I.D, because we're fundamentally coming at it from different worldviews. We're using different language.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk about trying to unpack how to have that conversation. But that's as I see it, right? Is that if I'm suffering, I'm here, but I'm suffering for His glory.
Right.
And that I don't know who I might testify to by how I deal with my last days on earth, by the witness of family or loved ones coming to visit to a patient who is so sick that they can't even speak or bear witness. But you never know what kind of life-changing impact that testimony might have that would not have occurred if the patient had gone the route of M.A.I.D, right? And God is so glorious that He can use even those terrible, sorrowful end-of-life situations for the advancement of His kingdom.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of really important stuff that you just shared. And I think that is so important to recognize, that we're just coming at this from different places, completely as different as you could be, because the Christian says that there's a very different purpose to life than the unbeliever. And for the unbeliever, a huge part of the purpose to life is avoiding suffering, being as comfortable for as long as possible, right? And so this is, in some ways, a very pragmatic decision for many who don't believe. There is simply like, if that's the point of life, to avoid suffering, and I can no longer do that, why ought I live? And obviously we see it very different. And like you said, suffering is not meaningless. I'm sure as a physician, you've seen people suffer well and been impacted by that personally. I know a lot of the time, Pastor Tim and I visit people in the hospital who are believers, who are suffering well. Man, we leave feeling like they've encouraged us more than we've been able to encourage them. It is a powerful thing to see people suffer well, and it's not without purpose, because the Bible is clear. And as you've already said, that suffering shapes us as God's people. And it's also really clear, 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about God's will for us is sanctification. Like, the point of our life is being made into the image of Christ. And usually, mostly the stuff that He uses in our lives to make us more like Jesus, to conform us to the image of the Son, are not the easy things. Right. And yet this is, like you said, glorious for us in a way to be made more like Him. So, there's a lot going on there, but the Bible does teach that we ought to have a theology of suffering that involves us suffering well. Romans 8:18 says, "The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed." So 2 Corinthians 4 says similar things. We do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Not that those verses are speaking about an end-of-life situation in a hospital bed, but I think it applies that, the suffering we go through now as believers, as hard as it is a blip in the grand scheme of eternity, and that there's value in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the application of that is very far-ranging. I'll also say that, in terms of suffering, like, people are, they pick hard jobs. right? Like I think of the nurses and the other physicians who work in the hospital, right? 12-hour shifts, sometimes 24-hour shifts, doing all of that. For me personally, a tremendous amount of my spiritual growth has been learning to rely on the Lord in the midst of those sleep-deprived nights where, my own natural inclination is not to be gracious, not to be compassionate, not to want to get up out of bed and see another patient, right? But it's through those experiences that he has caused me to grow, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And so the when you go through suffering, you do, it's for our own benefit, but as you say, it's also for the benefit of those around us, right? That we can be inspired and edified by the suffering that we see in others. And fundamentally, if Jesus suffered in this life, then we as his believers should expect to suffer as well, and to count it a blessing to be able to suffer like him.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I know many of you listening who have had family or loved ones go to be with the Lord. Their suffering has impacted others around you in their pursuit of the Lord. And I've seen that in my own family as loved ones have suffered well and then passed away, gone to be with Jesus. Some people who weren't even tracking with God at all are stirred in their spirit, and God uses that as a way to draw them to himself. And again, like you said, we don't know the impact our enduring suffering, trust in the Lord can have on people around us, can have on your nurses and your doctors. And so it's important to think through. And the Bible says a lot about life and death. We know this, right? So for the Christian who says, well, I don't even know, does the Bible say anything about M.A.I.D? There are a lot of verses we could go through, but I mean, fundamentally, when we talk about abortion, we said this a few weeks ago, the value of human life extends from birth to end of life. And if it is the unjustified taking of human life, we could say this is murder. The Bible's really clear. Do not murder, right? So we don't want to be participating in something that the Bible strictly condemns, but it also says things about the idea of like our times just being in God's hand. Psalm 31 says, my times are in your hand. David's writing this. So yeah, God is sovereign over all of our days. What do you think about that? That just resting in the idea that if God is over all creation, he knows when my last breath is meant to be. And I can trust in that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a question of who has ultimate sovereignty of our lives, right? Are they ours to spend as we would choose, or are our lives God, right? So none of us created ourselves, right? We had no input into that process.
Yep.
Psalms also talks about us being knitted together in our mother's wombs, right? Did we do the knitting? No, right? But then as soon as we're born, we feel like we have agency. And to a certain extent we do, right?
Sure.
Like obviously we are more able and equipped to make decisions about ourselves than other people should be allowed, right? So this is not undercutting individual rights when compared to somebody who is on an equal playing field in terms of their rights. So we're not saying you have to suffer and submit to the whims of other people, but we are saying that there's a hierarchy difference between God and his creation, which includes humans. And so our responsibility is to him and not fundamentally to ourselves.
Yeah. He's overall. He is ultimate authority over every part of our life. I love that you referenced Psalm 139 because that's actually what I was going to read just now.
Yes, I was going to. Absolutely knew it was Psalm 139 off the top of my head.
This is an awesome passage. There's many like it, but this one to me is kind of first in mind when we talk about end of life and birth. And it says this: "For you formed my inward parts; you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. here's the biggie. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So again, yeah, God is in control of when we are born, and he knows the future, and he knows when my last breath it ought to be and when it will be. And I think that there's actually a lot of comfort, and it may be the type of thing that can keep people awake at night in some capacity of, when am I going to die? But I think there's great comfort in knowing in his book were written every one of our days that were formed for us, and we can have a peace about that, knowing he's in control and we're not, right? Now maybe we can spend some time talking about, so again, the Bible is clear that M.A.I.D is not compatible with a Christian worldview. I think we can say that.
Yeah, and I think there's one, so I was thinking, what is maybe the clearest anecdote in the Bible if people want a direct example? And I would say it's probably the story of King Saul, right? Which is, I think, in 2 Samuel, right? So the predecessor to King David, and he's in battle against the Philistines, and he knows it's going south. He knows he's going to be captured by them. He expects a gruesome death from them, and he tells his armor bearer to kill him, right, so that he doesn't fall into their hands. And his armor bearer actually doesn't do it and runs away, so Saul ends up killing himself. Right. So then later, either that armor bearer or somebody pretending to be him shows up in David's camp and actually thinks that they're going to get, a attaboy from David by saying, hey, I killed your rival Saul. I put him to death. And does David say, oh, that was a great thing you did. You killed my enemy. You did what Saul wanted you to do. Right. Glad he didn't suffer at the hands of the Philistines. No, he says he actually orders the armor bearer put to death because he says it wasn't your right to take Saul's life. Now, he's talking about that in the context of the anointed king. Yeah. But still, it's a recognition that even though Saul wanted to be put to death, he wanted somebody else to do it for him. That does not give you the moral right to do something like that. And I think that's probably the most directly applicable example I can think of from the Bible. And it definitely does not give any indication that participating in somebody's unlawful death is
because they asked you to.
Right. Yeah. That simply having a desire to end your life does not excuse participants in that.
Wow, I'm really glad you mentioned that. That is a very, very fitting example. And that's what's going on. Saul, we know from other biblical accounts, when a king was captured in battle, it was not a pleasant experience. We're talking, big toes and thumbs cut off and kept as a trophy alive for a long time, or tortured, and their body displayed in really awful ways to send a message of power. Right? He doesn't want the suffering, and that is understandable, and so takes it into his own hands. Right? And I know these aren't exactly analogous to suffering with a terminal disease, but you're right. The Bible doesn't seem in any way to support participating in taking anyone's life in that way. Yeah, great example. So if that's how the Bible is clear about M.A.I.D, so if that's the Christian perspective, is that the Christian worldview is not compatible with embracing of M.A.I.D, how are we supposed to wrestle with this when people in our life think differently than us on this? And it's all hypothetical until that diagnosis or the suffering comes. What do I say if someone I love is pursuing M.A.I.D? What if they want me to, I won't say participate, but to be present in their last moments if they're going this route? There is a lot of very difficult matter of conscience kind of decisions for the Christian in these spots. And I know this is painful for many because it could be a thing, or it has already been a thing that they've walked through. But what do we say to the Christian that's trying to navigate their part to play in walking with someone who's at the end of their life or considering ending their life long before it ought to end?
Yeah. This is where we shift, I think, from, having a theological approach, right, where we have a clear sense that M.A.I.D is wrong as Christians, to understanding the human side of it, right? As pastors, as clinicians, that we want to acknowledge that these are really difficult and real world problems that people are truly suffering, and acknowledge too that if you don't share a Christian worldview, it actually seems completely rational to pursue
Absolutely.
M.A.I.D, right? So
Yeah.
it's difficult to argue with somebody who's coming at it from a totally different perspective that this is something they shouldn't do. And I can understand where people would say, well, this is, like religious authoritarianism to impose your views on me, right? But we've already talked about how the flip side is already occurring, where the secular worldview is being imposed on Christian physicians in terms of their rights to object from a conscience standpoint. So it is a sword that cuts both ways. But for families struggling with a loved one who's considering M.A.I.D, or for somebody who is considering M.A.I.D themselves, I think a lot of the time, there are so many considerations and emotions that go into somebody taking the step to choose M.A.I.D. And I think one of the benefits of having, if you can have a strong family relationship, if you can be part of a church community, or even if you can have a long-term care provider who knows you on a personal level to work through all of the things that are going on in your mind, the best way, I think, to make a decision to maybe seek something other than M.A.I.D is to really get into the deep fundamentals of why is somebody considering taking such a drastic step. Right. So, it is presented a lot of the time as we do, we want to alleviate suffering. But I think a lot of the time it's a desire to hold on to autonomy, to be remembered in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
When you still are functional, when you still look fairly healthy, when you're still coherent, right? To not want to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so I think for family members, it's trying to make that a safe thing for people to do, to be vulnerable, to let down a guard, right? I think actually in some respects, it is a holdover. Like I would guess that a lot of the current people, the current generation who's getting M.A.I.D are probably the boomers, right? Bit more of a stoic generation, bit more of, not wanting to appear what they would feel as weak or vulnerable, right? But understanding that, there's a beauty and intimacy in relationships when you are vulnerable with somebody, and trying to tease out, why do you want to take this route, right? People not wanting to be a burden on their families.
I'm sure for many that's a big thing too.
And what I would speak to that is, when people think, don't want to be a burden, they maybe don't anticipate what the emotional burden of having their family put through the process of them going through with M.A.I.D. I have not, to my recollection, met a family who was really excited or pleased that their family member was going to get M.A.I.D. For the most part, it's sort of a resigned acceptance of like, well, this is what they want. But it's very clear that if they had chosen otherwise, the family was going to be very committed to walking through the end of life process with them, and would have cherished more time with them.
And that's so important to know, because I think there's an idea that the only people who would pursue this have no one, right? They're suffering alone, and this kind of a situation. And that isn't necessarily the case.
No, I don't have, data at the tips of my fingers, but I actually think that for the most part, people who are pursuing M.A.I.D they tend to be well-educated, more affluent, with good connections, which suggests to me that part of it is that desire to maintain autonomy, to not be vulnerable. Alleviating suffering is definitely part of it, but a lot of the suffering is more not wanting to go through the process. So I think of one case where I was on an oncology rotation, so a cancer treatment rotation. I remember very clearly the oncologist was telling this patient, you have a cancer that I think we're more likely to be able to cure than not.
Wow.
And to the oncologist's shock, this patient said, actually, I've already made arrangements for M.A.I.D. That's what I'm going to pursue. And he said about himself, like, I'm a coward. I can't envision myself going through with chemotherapy.
Even just the treatment, even if it
just
could
the
be
treatment that probably
preventable,
more likely
cancer,
than not would have cured him.
Yeah. Wow.
And so you think about that and you think like, well, what could we be doing differently as a society as a medical, healthcare providing institution to support somebody in those spheres so that we can actually treat their disease and maybe cure them rather than help them end their life for a condition that if they had gone through it, maybe 5 years from now, they're looking back and going, oh man, I'm so glad I didn't pursue M.A.I.D because I wouldn't be alive here now, right?
Which is just a wild, that's a great example to share that was allowed to happen in a case where treatment is possible. And again, it makes me think of if an 18-year-old, these are, again, it's not a decision you can undo. Wow. So what I'm hearing you say is listening is really important. Understanding why someone is making these decisions and leading with listening rather than, again, imposing our worldview. Although it is important to share our worldview. Here's why I think that this is wrong. Here's why I think your life has this value, that suffering isn't meaningless. And again, it's not within our power to convince. This is the work of the Holy Spirit, but that can be a means that he uses, right, as those types of conversations. But it is a really difficult thing to try to understand. I think what you said about control is so fitting. Pastor Tim and I have talked about this, how this is kind of for some who are very against the Lord. This is almost the last chance to shake your fist at God and say, I decide, right? Rather than letting death come against your will in a natural sense. That isn't always the case, but it's sometimes could be. But I think the last question we'll hit just really briefly is, what does the Christian do then when their loved one is not willing to hear, their concerns, is not willing to understand their worldview and the value of life and the value of suffering even, and they just say, no, I'm doing this and I want you to be there. I want you to hold my hand. How does a Christian wade through that decision? Is that a matter of conscience decision? Is it just fundamentally wrong to be present? Are you complicit in that case? Is that something you've ever wade through?
No, I haven't. I mean, I have never fortunately had to struggle with that personally. Certainly as a clinician, I opted out of any, opportunities to be part of a M.A.I.D case. I will say that, I have talked, when I was a resident, I talked to other trainees who had witnessed a M.A.I.D case, and it was profoundly disturbing to them. Yeah. And they had witnessed actually the daughter of the patient who received that procedure just started screaming the moment that her mom was gone, because it was so sudden, I think, and so dramatic. And a lot of the time when death is approaching, it isn't always traumatic like that. That's actually an exception even in healthcare, is that there's usually a slow gradual decline, deterioration, right? Which is sometimes merciful to the patient, in that they start to lose the ability to actually have some of that existential distress. They don't register discomfort as much, right? And the family can slowly come to terms with the process of death, and you kind of get used to it. M.A.I.D is so sudden by definition, and you're taking somebody who is still functional. Yeah, well, maybe 26 and relatively healthy, even. Right? And that's an exceptional case, probably even by M.A.I.D standards. But yes, you can have somebody who, could have gone and done anything he wanted to that week, right? And then his life just ends. But it is the suddenness of it which is very traumatic. So I would counsel families that you might be surprised at how traumatic the experience is, and be very cautious about subjecting yourself to that. You're probably also going to feel a lot of guilt. I would expect that somebody would feel guilt if they think that M.A.I.D is wrong, that they were there in the room when it happened. Yeah. So I wouldn't as a blanket statement say, from a conscience perspective, no, nobody can, right? But I would be very cautious about it. I also think that sometimes if you're, I would pray that if you're firm enough and if you're strong enough in your opinion and you say, no, I can't support you in that. It grieves me too much. I think I just object to it too strongly. Maybe that's the last opportunity for the person seeking M.A.I.D to have second thoughts about it, right? You don't know how you're going to influence it. Sometimes we make decisions that we only stick to contingent on the people around us accepting and going along with.
Yeah,
right?
if they
I mean,
mildly disagree, but then
all
attend
been
in
that
person.
boat where we kind of, and I'm not saying this for M.A.I.D in every case, but where we float an idea and we stick to it with a degree of certainty, depending on how many people around us kind of think it's a, go along with it, right?
And it is so hard because as a Christian, there's other moral situations like this where we feel like our attendance can be a sort of confirmation, or that I'm celebrating this, I'm complicit in this, and this is a difficult one, man. Because when someone you love is going to die, regardless of what you try to do, to leave them alone is, I think, the factor that moves many people to feel like they need to be there. I'd say this is a matter of conscience decision. As a Christian, it's not something that I would be able to do, I don't think. But again, is my attendance kind of shaping their decision? And yeah, we try to persuade, we try to point them to Christ and show that this is not compatible with the Christian worldview. You pray a lot, man, and it is a hard thing to weigh through. But I think it is a difficult thing for a Christian to attend and hold someone's hand through the whole thing if they're adamantly opposed to this. And is my presence shaping their decision? That's a really important question to be asking. And we seek the Lord's wisdom on this, but it is certainly not something that we would say is compatible with our Christian perspective when we look at the Bible and God's authority over life and death. So with all that said, Dr. James, thanks so much for being here.
Can I put one more plug in?
You absolutely can.
So we talked last episode about the Christian Medical and Dental Association.
Yeah.
So I got that name right this time. So it's an international organization, but it has a very active presence in Canada. And they are fighting very hard legally to try and protect the rights of Christian doctors in Canada against being compelled to do things against their conscience. So if people are looking for ways that they can kind of be active in this field, starting with the CMDA website, which has lots of great resources to kind of get up to speed on this issue. There are ways to kind of help support them in their fight and their ministry. They do also a lot of campus work in the medical schools to support Christian dentists and or dentistry students and medical students in an early part of their career that's life-changing and very challenging. So a very worthwhile organization to support and to pray for.
That's awesome.
So I can just point people in that direction.
Yeah, well, thank you. We definitely have med students and hopeful med students and dental students that would benefit from checking that out, I'm sure, who are believers. So thanks for that plug. And thanks for listening, Bluewater. You are loved. Have a great rest of your day.